Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Ask Me Anything session on digital marketing. My name is Christina Wood, and I'm the Director of Programs on the Start and Scale team here at Communitech. Before we get started, I just wanted to put out a quick reminder that you can ask any of your questions in the Q&A functionality featured at the right-hand side of your screen. We do encourage you to ask any and all questions, as we really want this to be a discussion. Also, if you want to connect with our speaker, Vinay, after today's session, please reach out to your Communitech CSM or advisor, and they'd be happy to get you connected. And here's a list of our upcoming Ask Me Anything events. So next week, we have Managing Your Investor Pipeline. That will be our last session for June, and then we'll be taking a break over the summer and kicking AMAs back off in September. You can find all of our past AMA recordings on our website, communitech.ca, and we host them all there as resources for companies to refer back to. So you'll be able to find this one following today's session there as well. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Vinay Nair, Communitech Growth Coach and Fractional CMO. He's going to get us started on, some early concepts of what to think about with digital marketing. So he's got a lot of content to cover today, but really what's important to us is that we get your questions answered. So we can kind of flip around and adjust as needed, depending on what's important to you. So with that, welcome, Vinay. Thank you for taking the time to join today. And I will throw it over to you to get started.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks everyone for coming today and for those who listen in the recording afterwards. As Christina mentioned, my name is Vinay Nair. I'm a growth coach here with the Communitech team. I really focus on the go-to-market, coaching and the design and architecture and helping a lot of the startups and scale-ups here at Communitech build out their digital acquisition and their customer acquisition strategy. I also serve as a fractional CMO for a number of up-and-coming startups here in Canada and abroad, where I come and help them in the early stages to set their strategy and work with them to make sure that they achieve it. A bit about me. I mean, before I went into freelance like fractional work, I served a number of positions in sales and marketing leadership roles over the last few decades. And I put this small little diagram here to kind of show the diversity of experiences. So I started my career back about 20 years ago, dating myself, but in a startup as a fifth employee, and that's where I really got the tech bug. My grad school roommate at the time started a company in our house, and I was forced to be hired with them, and the rest is history. But over the next 20 years or so, I did a series of assignments and work experiences in different types of companies, ranging from startups that are moving into scale-up world, from scale-ups that are moving into major tech world, and also spent a tour of duty in almost 50% of my career in the major techs, really understanding, the concept of scale. And so most people would say, well, what's your career strategy here, Vinay? You seem to be jumping around, all these different places. And I like to reflect back on the last 2 decades and say, well, it was the learning experience that really, really mattered to me. Working in these various different environments, seeing the levels of development that they're in, looking at some of the challenges that they had and how we overcame them, and what made sense for the right stage of growth in the company. And so I find it very enlightening now as I'm kind of coaching young startups and scale-ups on how to grow after spending time on the other side of the fence to where they want to be, and really helping them bridge the gap to where they want to go. So today, when Christina first reached out and said, hey, we should probably do some marketing-oriented AMA sessions, I didn't know quite where to start. And so I asked her to poll the community and ask what are some of the things that the Communitech community was really interested in learning more about. And so the way that I've structured this presentation today is really around the questions that came back to me. And I put some slides together to kind of tell the story, but I'm really, almost like manufacturing a Q&A session here between the community and myself. And so the first question that came up was, what is a B2B digital marketing strategy? Oh, and before I get into the different questions, what we'll do is that if you have any questions that follow on to these questions or anything that comes up, you can put it into the Q&A session. And before I go into the next question, I'll pause to see if anything came up, and Christina will help me know when they do come up, and I'll answer them at that time. So the first question is, what is a B2B digital marketing strategy? And that's a very, very broad question. And so, I like to kind of break it up. And when people talk about digital marketing, especially when a lot of the coaching clients that I have, and they come and say, "Hi, we want to start with digital marketing," and I ask them, "Well, what do you mean by that? What does digital marketing mean to you?" And the reason why I ask that now is that, in my mind, things have evolved to such a state right now that it's no longer digital marketing, it's just marketing. Like, everything is becoming a hell of a lot more digital these days. And so it's not about when I started my career where it's like, okay, we should probably start to, experiment with some of these digital channels as people are spending time there. The reality is things have flipped, into that direction in a much more faster way than it's ever done before. And so I always like to get dramatic and tell stories, but you'll often hear me say the statement, "The death of the salesman, the rise of the marketing machine." And it's a very controversial statement, and I'm not saying that salesmen are going to go away. That's not what I mean at all. What I mean by that is that the way that we sell today, that traditional form of B2B software sales, is really, really rapidly evolving. There's a lot more digital marketing automation in play, a lot more digital channels, and a lot more ways to engage customers in a way that hasn't been in the past. And there's a number of reasons why this is happening, right? I remember this graph on the top here by eMarketer. When I started my career in 2001, I remember looking at this graph, and at that time, digital, the percentage of digital spending was so low, and the proportion of digital spending as a proportion of all up ad spending was like less than 5% at that point in time. It was a very, very much an experimental medium. And what's interesting is that even pre-pandemic in 2019 is like the point in which we actually crossed the chasm. When we say we, I say digital ad spending crossed the chasm and became 51% of total ad spend. So it wasn't like very long ago that we just crossed that threshold. And the projections here, by eMarketer is that by 2024, digital ad spending will be about 70% of all up ad spending in general, right? So it goes back to my point around it's just marketing. It's not digital marketing anymore. The online mediums have just mainstream now, and everyone really has to pay attention. What's behind it? I mean, obviously the internet. We talked about the power of the internet, and when I first started my career, I mean, it was just a very nascent, medium. But we had a bunch of people that were born in this world, which we call digital natives, that are now progressing to become the consumers that are actually buying our products and services on the other end. And they grew up in this world, and they grew up in these mediums, and therefore, if you want to go and interact with them, you have to play where they play. And if that wasn't even accelerated before with COVID-19, with what I call the great virtualization of the workforce, everyone's seen that cartoon by the Marketoonist at some point on social media, but it's accelerating people's digital adoption in ways that are going to be so much more pronounced. And so it's not about do we do digital marketing, it's about how do we do digital marketing in this new world that it's going to make much more sense. And so I always like to show the customer acquisition process whenever I talk to my clients who I'm coaching. It's like, one of the first things I do is like, well, let's show me your sales funnel, show me your sales stages, and let's overlay that to the customer life cycle. And as you noticed over time, there's more and more digital touch points in the sales cycle, not just in the early stages of lead generation like it was in the past, but you're starting to see a lot more prominence of digital channels post lead and post sale. And so, the importance of really thinking about your digital marketing mix within the context of your entire customer acquisition lifecycle is so much more pronounced today than ever was before. And so we spend time talking about that and where can we make things more digital as we move forward. And so you'll hear me talk a lot about the digital marketing mix, and I call it sometimes the PO mix, the paid, owned, earned mix. And really, it's just a way to classify the different channels that are available for companies that they start to think about their digital marketing strategy or their marketing strategy. And so all the category of paid includes all those paid advertising mediums, those channels where you have to go pay in order to play in those channels and to get access to people in those channels. So what's very common here is pay-per-click, which has very much been popularized by the Google Ads products, but also display ads, remarketing, retargeting, paid social, native ads, paid influencers, like anything where you have to go and pay in order to get access falls into this paid bucket. The second area, which is an area where I think is the more substantive, is really around the owned. The owned mediums are stuff like your own website, your blog, your profiles, your email marketing strategy, your social media properties, or your social pages. These are all things that you don't have to pay, but it takes a while for you to develop prominence within these channels. And in my opinion, it's one of those things that really dictate the strength of your brand. You can really tell the strength of a company's brand by how strong their owned channel positions are. And then the last one's really around earned. And so when we say earned, these are not necessarily paid strategies, but going on to mediums where people already exist, and watering holes and communities, and then earning a spot on those mediums. So an example of this is, social media, like building out your LinkedIn, profile and growing your number of followers on there is an example of growing your earned strategy. In addition to that is the popularization of reviews. You have a number of review sites like G2 Crowd and Trust Radius and a number of marketplaces where people come to get opinions and advice on how to buy B2B software or any software products for that matter. And so those sites are now becoming these earned mediums and channels that you have to go and play in and develop your presence in. There's PR, what you call media coverage. So getting mentioned in highly influential, high domain authority websites, guest blogging and guest posting, getting mentioned, or what they call referring domains. Getting your content shared by networks within the LinkedIn community, for example, and influencers, right? Really trying to influence the influencers, the people who are recommending to other companies. And so each of these three categories, it's ideal that you have an optimal mix that actually leverage each of these channels. And depending on the market, depending on the competitiveness of it, the mix may change. This is what I call the PO mix. So you may be leaning on paid in the beginning, but eventually lean back into owned over time as you get more mature and you double down on earned during some major moments. But generally over time, on average, you should have a really, really good mix of this to have a really healthy mix. And so I'll talk a bit about these channels in a bit more detail. But before I did that, I wanted to show some numbers, like in terms of where B2B CMOs are spending from a budget perspective by channel. And so this is by marketing charts. They have some really, really good data there to kind of give some good benchmarking in terms of where people are thinking. And so digital advertising, I think, is a catch-all for all paid, paid media in general. So that's definitely an area that's going to continue to be invested in, increasing investment in. Email marketing, a lot of people talk about how email is dead, but everyone I speak to and all the research I see is probably the most cost-effective, high ROI channel for many customers today. And so you're starting to see a lot more continued investment in that area. Mobile marketing, which is basically internet marketing or any kind of marketing that involves any kind of geo-targeting. Paid search continues to be a strong area investment, and of course website, SEO, social marketing, partner. So all these are examples of channels that get part of your digital marketing mix. And you can use these benchmarks to indicate where do you want to go. What are some of the, especially if you don't have a strong digital marketing strategy today, or or digital as part of your marketing strategy today, you want to take a look at some of these tested and true channels that other B2B CMOs are and see if it's a good fit for you or not. So when I double click, excuse me, when I double click on the paid piece of it, there's really 3 buckets that I talk about in paid quite a bit. One is, paid search. Sure, that should say paid search. I think there's a little bit of typo there. And there's paid social, and then there's third-party syndication. So paid search is really like Google and Bing are the big global players in paid search. When it comes to Google ads and Bing ads. Of course, if you go into like international markets, you have Baidu, you have Yandex, you have a number of players that are really strong in certain country markets like China and Russia that are important to consider in your paid search strategy if you're going into those markets. But for the most part, Google gets the lion's share of paid advertising, as you can see from the graph above. Paid social is all the social media sites where people go there for for interacting with each other and connecting with their community, are now offering paid options to do targeting with there as well. I mean, not now, they've always been doing it. Facebook's a leader in this space with the ownership of the Facebook and Instagram and a number of these properties, consumer type properties, but they also are very strong in B2B. I know many B2B CMOs that have a really solid channel fit in the Facebook community to go target people in prospect accounts in businesses. Amazon, of course, with their marketplace, their B2C marketplace, but people are starting to see a lot of B2B purchases starting to come into the Amazon marketplace now, and it's becoming a viable channel for them to think about. Microsoft, of course, has a number of properties, not just on the Bing platform, but also they own Xbox and they own a number of other consumer properties like MSN and so forth. But most notably, they own LinkedIn, which is one of the largest and more powerful B2B paid social communities. And the third category is really on third-party syndication. And so when I talk about third-party syndication, it's a catch-all category. People have different words for this. And it probably warrants at this point in time for me to break that out into different categories. But here's where I put stuff like publishers, like people like TechTarget, for example, is a well-known content syndicator. Capterra, for example, is a very well-known review site, and G2 Crowd's a very well-known review site as well. And so all of these third-party syndicators have pay-per-click and other types of targeting and banner strategies that they will sell you as well. And so when you're starting to think about your market and your digital marketing strategy, you're going to look at these 3 buckets of paid and really look at what's the most viable for you in the strategy you're trying to go forward with. And then there's something else what I call the digitization of physical marketing. And it's really opening up a lot of new channels that folks have to consider in this new world. And what I mean by digitization of physical marketing is that you're starting to see digital creeping into what were once physical motions, like events, for example. You're starting to see a lot more digital experiences being created around events through mobile applications and other kind of location-based services within event scenarios. And so many of you probably, pre-pandemic remember going to events and noticing that some of the larger, more established events are starting to build these digital experiences that were surrounding the events. And a lot of advancement, not only in location-based services, but also in IoT and sensor-type technology is also bringing in a lot of capabilities into this space as well. We're also seeing a lot of digitization of what was traditionally called print. Many of you are probably familiar with Kindle and the Paperwhite capability, the Remarkable tablet. These are all ways in which things that were traditionally paper-based advertising mediums that are being replicated in digital formats, but trying to keep the experience the same. So if anybody's ever used a Remarkable tablet or a Kindle Paperwhite, it feels like paper, like when you're drawing on it and so forth. And so it's serving as a bridge for those that are not completely moved into the digital realm of media consumption. And last but not least is really around digital out of home. And this is where I see a lot of opportunity for marketers today. The notions of kind of melding the physical and virtual worlds are becoming much more clear now with stuff like augmented reality and virtual reality. You know, these types of commercial products and consumer products like HoloLens and Google Glass. You know, these type of things are starting to bring those worlds together and open up new channels. But even in a less sophisticated way, digital out of home has really impacted the outdoor media space. Now, outdoor media was always something that was a very B2C centric marketing channel, at least when I first started in this gig. But if you're probably noticing a lot now in the cities that you're in, when you're driving by highways, most of those outdoor signs are being replaced with digital screens. And those digital screens are a hell of a lot more interactive, a lot more visual, and they have ways to measure how many people have actually looked at them. And so now we've basically just extended the screen, you know, out of people's homes and offices and onto the highways and into the elevators everywhere where they go. And the targeting on those products are actually very, very compelling as a part of a mix of a digital marketing strategy. So, you know, I just wanted to throw those out there because, you know, it's something that's starting to be included in the digital mix now, even though they're very physical offerings, and goes to my earlier point about that melding that's happening right now. And there's new channels every day, you know, and one of the things is a joke about this because that was going on social media, a meme, I think, which says, you know, every CMO is dreading the email from their CEO to ask them what their TikTok strategy is. And that's just the reality of being in marketing these days, is that new channels pop up, new fads come up every day, and people start spending more and more time in these areas. And you always have to continually evaluate these new channels. And so TikTok, you know, was one of those things, came out of the Asian subcontinent, you know, took the world by storm, and is grabbing more and more share of people's attention online, including B2B customers who spend their personal lives in this space, right? And so a lot of brands are really rethinking, okay, well, how do I go spend time there? And then that eventually gets circled up to B2B brands as well. Clubhouse, I'm sure many of you are participating in some of those drop-in audio conversations. A very, very interesting medium, very low tech, but it's grabbing a lot of attention. And so many brands are starting to think, how do I spend time in here? And how do I engage with my consumers in this new avenue where they like to spend their time? And I put Fortnite out here just as a kind of somewhat controversial, but a real view of new mediums where people are looking to interact with their customers and their future customers, i.e., you know, the youth generation. And you know, I noticed it with my own children when they're playing Fortnite, how they can buy skins, right? They can buy different types of costumes for their avatars, and they can be branded. And so my son the other day asked me if he can buy the Raptors, you know, version of the of skin that he wanted to play in his Fortnite game. And so somehow in that interaction, the Raptors or the MLSE made some money in that, right? So these are all things as they kind of pop up now. It seems like they're on the periphery, particularly when you're a B2B marketer, but it's something you need to always keep your eyes on, because these channels could become very meaningful and differentiated ways to engage with your customers depending on their demographic. So let me pause there. And just kind of that's kind of how I talked about the channels and the strategies. Is there any questions on that before I move forward?
I don't see anything there, Vinay, but maybe we'll just give folks a second if they're typing.
Sure.
I think we're good to move on. And if I see anything come in, I'll let you know. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and so reach out to me or to your customer success advisor as well if you want to talk more about that. But that was just like an introduction to B2B, digital marketing and the channels that are involved. But the second question that I got was how to choose the right channels and platforms for your company and how to optimize them for optimal performance. And this is a big, big topic. Like I could spend an hour on this topic alone. So I want to just glaze over the top and kind of give you my perspective on it, and we can talk about where if you want to go dive in a little bit deeper. And so I talked about all those channels in the last section, right? There's so many to choose from, and where do you know where to start? And this is what a lot of the stuff that I do with my coaching clients is start with helping them with their research. And a lot of them do this research as a part of their product design in the first place, persona-based research, for example. They do the user stories and they create product based on those user stories. And so what I always ask my clients to do is to take that one step further and apply that to your acquisition journey. So think about not only how they use your product and get value from your product, but also how do they get to your product? How do they find out about you? What are some of the mediums that they read and they consume? What's the age demographic of your average buyer, and what is some of the most popular mediums with that particular age demographic, or gender, or even geographical demographics? Each of these have a play into the types of media consumption that they do as a persona. And so I typically always ask everyone to start there. Like, let's talk with your existing customers. Usually when I join a company or I take on a new client, I ask to speak to some of the customers, and I ask weird questions to them, like, what do you read on the weekends? And they look back at me quizzically as to why I'm asking them these personal questions. But the reason why I'm doing it is because I'm trying to understand, what their media preferences are. And when you get to that level of understanding, talking to your existing customers, and you ask the same question to at least 10 of them, let's say, and you start to see some, overlap in terms of what they like to read, what they like to do, in the office, what type of stuff do they like to, events they like to go to. These are the types of things you want to do with your early customers to really understand what channels will probably make a lot of sense. In other areas, especially for new entrants in existing markets, is really looking at what the competition is doing, and really studying how they're going to market and what channels that they're getting a lot of traction with. And so we spend some time looking at their kind of core competitors, direct competitors, indirect competitors, and really analyzing their go-to-markets, looking at their paid, owned, and earned strategies, looking at where they seem to be investing most money, assuming that they're investing money in things that are actually making them money. And we use that as a starting point to really understand what the landscape looks like from a competitive perspective. Now, I get a pushback sometimes from some clients saying, well, I don't want to be like the competition. I want to be differentiated. I want to do something different. And you still can. But it's always great to look at that landscape first and see how they're operating, so you can see what they do as kind of table stakes. And then you can come up with very creative ideas or channels or mediums to reach in a differentiated way that might be very, very different for your organization. And so we spend a lot of time talking about this and doing that competitive go-to-market research, not just product analysis, because that seems to be where most folks spend time when they do competitive research, is like, what's their product do? What does our product do? What I do is I help the clients spend time looking at how do they go to market and how can we differentiate. And the last one's really market research. And that word's so broad that it almost means nothing. But to me, when I'm talking about it, I use the Porter's 5 forces here as indicators. That it's like in some of the companies that I deal with, especially here at Communitech, there isn't a really established competitor. Like they're really competing against status quo. So how do you go and do the assessment of the competitive landscape and their go-to-market strategies? And so what I typically do in this case is I look at not necessarily competitors, but market participants. So looking at people like partners, suppliers, even leaders in the markets that are adjacent to the solution that you're providing. An example, in one of my last jobs, we were in the legal tech space, and we didn't have really a lot of direct competitors, although we had some smaller ones. We weren't trying to aspire to be like them. We wanted to aspire to be like the leaders in the market. And so we looked at large, legal tech providers who were targeting the same audience that we were, and looking at how they went to market as well to see what channels were working for them, what channels weren't. And that type of analysis in the very, very beginning is really the foundation for you to go and select your digital marketing strategy. And there's this concept of like persona surround that I talk about a lot. And once you really understand that persona and how your competitors and how your markets are actually reaching that persona, it's like looking at what their media preferences are, what their channel preferences are, not only on the professional level, so looking at what they read and what they spend online doing, the associations they're part of, the review sites that they read, but also looking at their route to work. Do they take the GO train to work? Do they spend a lot of time commuting? Are they geographically positioned in an area where you can go and do some targeted digital out of home, in their elevators, as well as a consumer, where they spend some of their consumer time. And people really underestimate using consumer channels to go and reach business decision makers. And the reality is that everybody is a person at home. And so, how you reach them in ways that are going to be meaningful for them in the mediums that they spend their time in is really going to be the way you get to them. And continuous improvement. So one of the things that I talk a lot about is that you almost have to have a culture for digital marketing and marketing in general. And no one really knows what's the exact formula of channel and content and strategy mix for a company in a particular market. And so you just have to test it out. You have to have a hypothesis. You look at the benchmarks. You look what the competitors are doing. You look at the market participants, and you make a hypothesis of what channel is going to work for you. And you run a pilot, a small pilot, without putting a lot of money into it first. And you go and see what the conversion rates look like. You measure the success of that. Was the conversion great? Where did the conversions break off? Was it at the impression at the cost per click to lead, or was it lead to close? What part in the journey did you see the drop off? And you kind of refine, you analyze and you refine. And then when you get to a point of channel fit, we call it, where you start to see a repeatable performance from a particular channel, that's when you start to think about ways to automate it. How do you automate that into what I call evergreen status? So that channel becomes a continual source of inbound demand for your organization without having to have a person looking at it every single day. And so that's the process that we tend to go through, and it's what I call continuous improvement. But it's a cultural mindset you need to keep on your team and in your company to support that type of mind frame. I'll pause there quickly to see if any other questions came up.
Yeah, Vinay, a couple did come in, and I think you partially touched on some of them. So we have a question here. What is the primary channel that people use? And so I think I heard you, say that you got to kind of figure out what's best for your company. But in general, is there a channel that is more successful than others for companies?
Yeah, look, if you take a B2B lens, I'm going to assume that's the lens you want to take, because we have a strong B2B tradition in Communitech. The channels there that you fundamentally see work the most is search. That's the number one you see people focus on: organic search and paid search. And I think that's an area where a lot of organizations end up getting the most value in the beginning, and they build upon that foundation. And there's a lot of reasons why search is there, but primarily is because when people are searching for a solution, they are basically very high intent consumers. And as a result of that, you want to capture those, that low-hanging fruit, or the fish that are jumping in the barrel, if you will, first, before you start to go and reach out to those that are further back in the buying cycle. Great.
The next question is just around, for smaller marketing teams, what are a few strategies or main focus areas you would recommend for folks who are new to paid strategies?
The best, so the best is a combination of two things: is learning and doing. And so I find that a lot of folks go out and do the certificates and do all the reading, and they don't get the chance to actually apply that right away. And then it just becomes like good trivia that never gets used. And so I always kind of suggest a combination of learning. And so HubSpot is one of my favorite places where I send a lot of my people, including myself, to go and learn about the strategy, what's latest in digital marketing. All their courses are for free. It's a brilliant content marketing strategy we can spend a whole session on. But I would say, take some of those courses there and just kind of get yourself familiar with the strategy and the frameworks. But then the best thing is to go and do it. And if you're not working for a company that is doing digital marketing, I would starting with your own blog, and starting with your own, kind of side hustle type businesses, because it's so easy to open up a Shopify store and just get working. That's the best way to learn.
Okay, great. What is the best strategy or digital marketing mix for startups nowadays? i.e., is social media a good starting point?
Yeah, this is I get this question a lot, right? Obviously because of your Communitech and a lot of startups here, but they're the social media, they all have their own purposes, right? And so social is really, really good for brand development and awareness, but not the best thing if you're really thinking about demand generation. And so what I find a lot of startup companies are in a bit of a crux was they need to be known as an entity. They need to be known as a company that exists in their market. So the awareness is important to them, but they also need revenue today. And so what I always tell them to do is really start with your own strategy. So your website, getting a really, really amazing website, getting the right content marketing strategy in place so that you're ranking for the most high intent keywords in search, and organically, not even paid. I'm just talking about organically. And that takes a little bit of discipline to go and build out the right content marketing strategy so you do get ranked that way. And executing the right strategies to go and make sure that you're showing up in search the best way. But I think that's the low-hanging first foundational piece you do. Once you have a good standing from an organic perspective, then you can start to amplify that with paid search. Again, because if someone is looking for CRM software, they're just in a much higher intent phase of their buying cycle, and you want to be known to those people when they're in that stage of their buying. And so I always say start with organic social, expand to search, do social media as part of your own strategy. So like you're creating your presences, on those LinkedIn campaigns, and you're growing a following organically with the content that you create. But you do paid social after you've done paid search.
Okay. Thank you. One last question here before we move on. For getting customer validation in a survey, what strategies do you recommend? This person's created posts offering special live screening to entice responses.
Yeah, to get customer validation for the value props, like I'm assuming that you want to get validation on your core value to the customer. So I find that you start off with doing in-person interview, open-ended, for the first 10. And you ask the same set of questions across those first 10 before you create your survey. And the reason why is because sometimes you don't know what the ABC choices should be. You're grasping, you think you know what it is, but they might come up with something like a D that you would never have thought about. And so when you do those qualitative interviews, you can really capture a lot of those options, and you can make a better survey before you go and screen it out.
Great. I think we're ready to move on to the next section. Thanks.
Yeah. And I have 12 minutes left, right? So I'm gonna put the next questions in a little bit of a fast gear, okay? To get through some of the content. So the next question I had is, how do you measure success of your digital marketing program? And this is a very, very simple answer, or what I call a short answer is revenue. That's the way I look at it, and that takes time sometimes for you to realize it, depending on the length of your sales cycle. But really looking at revenue, the pipeline it generates, the leads it generates, and keeping that as the core metric is really going to be the way you can truly understand if it's going to be something that's going to help you guys. Return on marketing investment. So the other thing is that you can get all this revenue in the door, like you make it, $100,000 of revenue from digital marketing. If you spend $200,000 to go get that revenue, then it's not a success, right? So always looking at the return on marketing investment, the cost of acquisition, cost per click, cost per lead, and so on and so forth. So these are what I call the holy three that I tend to look at. But there's a much more longer answer to that, which I can spend a hell of a lot more time on. And when you look at the different mediums and you look at the different types of channels, each of them have different type of sub-metrics that you can use to know that you're on the right track before the revenue shows up. And so this diagram here is messy on purpose. I can spend a whole 45 minutes on this. But really it's on conversion rates, cost per click, cost per engagement. These are all different metrics you can use to know that you're trending in the right direction. But fundamentally, revenue is the ultimate goal. What are some of the common tools to execute your digital marketing program? Again, this is a very, very, very complicated answer. There's about 8,000 plus tools to help you drive your digital marketing. And many of you have seen this graph before. This is like this publication called chiefmartech.com puts this map together of all the 8,000 tools and what categories they're in. And the reality is it's very, very, very complicated to look at all those tools that way. So I like to organize them a little bit more towards what you're trying to achieve. And at what stage of the customer life cycle, right? So if you're trying to reach your customer like for the first time and make them from a anonymous visitor to a prospect of yours and eventually to a lead of yours, there's a set of tools here on the right-hand side of the circle. It's very small. I'm going to zoom in and go through a few. And then if you want to start to convert them from a lead to like a sale, there's a bunch of tools in that category. And then once they're a customer, how do you continue to make them advocates and get them to go and refer more customers to you and be an advocate of your brand, right? And so in the reaching prospects piece, just like this is when the customer is a stranger to you, and you want to turn them into a lead of yours or a known contact of yours. There's many tools and categories of tools in this space, but for most startups in Communitech at the stage that we're at, really using Google Analytics and some of these third-party tools like SEMrush and Moz is really your starting point. Like there's nothing more than you need. I put Analytics 360 here because Google sells a very expensive solution called Analytics 360, which allows you to really bring together the power of the Google data in a much more sustainable way, because GA is not the easiest thing to use. But again, you need to be able to spend some money for that. So I just say use Google Analytics and some of these other third-party tools like SEMrush and Moz. When it comes to like once you got that customer into your website and you want to actually engage them and get them to become a lead of yours, obviously you need to have a really, really strong foundation on your content management system or CMS. And there's a number of tools to go do that. There's WordPress, there's Drupal, there's Forestry. All have different elements and layers for the type of website you're trying to build. The majority of the world's on WordPress, and you have a really strong ecosystem of not only third-party plugins to go and make WordPress work for you, but also a lot of consultants that you can get in the ecosystem that can go work on it. But Drupal has some stronger, open source type, development frameworks that you can do some really powerful things with. And some other things as well is as you start getting more and more traffic, you want to start thinking about some of these tools to help you know what people are doing on your website, like Hotjar and Unbounce, and really optimizing the experience of the website so that it becomes a place where they want to actually convert and engage with you. And last but not least is really converting leads to revenue. Well, not last but not least, but there's a number of tools in this area. I'm a big fan of Drift. I'm not paid by them or anything like that, but I've used them before. They got an amazing engagement platform where you can start to engage in conversations with your customers on your websites and convert them. But also customer review sites is a very powerful tool when a customer is deciding to purchase your software or not. And so this is another area where Trust Radius is a tool or a platform I've used before, where they're not only a place where reviews are housed, but you have a way to integrate those reviews into your website as testimonials and into your sales enablement as content to help your sellers go close a deal. And last but not least, A/B testing. So this is one of those things when you're testing all these channels out, seeing which one fits. You always want to to do A/B testing as a way to test the copy and make sure that it's performing well. And so Optimize is a really, really good tool that will help you do that. And the last area is really around engaging customers. So of course, the standard marketing automation platforms, HubSpot, Salesforce, Marketo, are the ones that are most used in the startup space from what I can see. There's a lot more people in this market for sure. But I typically find that some of the larger scale-ups are in Salesforce and Marketo, and some of the smaller ones are using HubSpot and equally happy with it as well. And of course, there's social, PR, and analysis tools as well. So the last question I had, and I have a few minutes to address it, is really around, should you outsource digital marketing or bring it in-house? And this is, again, is a very, very it depends kind of answer. There's a study that's being done, and I encourage everyone to go check it out, between Google and the Boston Consulting Group, BCG, where they actually analyze how mature companies are in their digital marketing journey. I use this tool a lot whenever I build a new digital marketing function. I take the assessment when we start, and then I go and measure year over year how we're moving across this journey from being a nascent digital marketing company to an emerging, to connected, to multi-moment. And this has a lot to do to help you understand if you want to outsource it or not. The graph on the right here very quickly shows you that people outsource a number of things, but keep some things in-house. And so when you think about blogging and email marketing, a lot of the owned properties I talked about before, people tend to want to do that in-house because it requires writing content, which requires subject matter expertise. But as you start to move into some of the paid channels, you start seeing more and more outsourcing kind of happen. And so the answer is it depends. Every company and every industry has their mix, and it really needs to have an assessment on where you are in your journey in that mix. But there's also this other concept. Many of you have seen this graph before on the startup life cycle. There's these moments in your maturity as a company also when to consider outsourcing and not and in-housing. And there's two moments that really matter when making this decision. One is really the product market fit matters for the company in general, right? You need to go and make sure you have a product that's meeting the needs of a customer base and repeatably. Once you've reached that, there's a thing called channel product fit. And that's really trying to understand how you're going to go to market and acquire customers in a repeatable way. And so when you're leading up to that, I just drew this diagram as kind of a quick, reference point. But what I find is that a lot of startup companies start off with doing SEO organic as their foundational layer of the digital marketing strategy. They layer in earned social, they layer in email marketing, and all this is really being done in-house for the most part. But then they start to dip their toe into new channels like paid search and paid social and paid content syndication. And there's a lot of experimentation that happens in this stage. But the minute you start to get to a channel fit, you start to realize that, okay, I don't need to go through an agency or specialist anymore. This is now becoming a part of what our company is and what it does. And so then you start to see people sort of bring that in-house. And then as they kind of mature and they get into becoming a larger company, they start to revisit outsourcing some of that again because it starts to not become a differentiator anymore. The market is mature, the company is mature, and they're looking for outsourcing efficiencies. And so you start to see like there's a lot of kind of moving back and forth between in-housing it or outsourcing it. And it really depends on that channel as well. And in some cases, like in SEO organic, you keep it in-house, but you also augment it with third-party capability to drive the backlinking and some of the stuff that's more commodity-based. And so, I'm gonna, just in the interest of time, leave you with a few principles that there's always a certain state of disruption that happens in digital marketing, in marketing in general. And so you're always riding the wave. Some channels will do amazing for you in certain parts of your journey, and then eventually will become like the law of diminishing returns starts to set in. And then you have to go find your next wave that you need to jump on. And so that's the type of mindset you have to have when you're thinking about a digital marketing strategy, is like just continually monitoring the environment for the next wave and ensuring you're on top of that wave when it does come. And then there's always be a learning mindset in this particular scenario. So when I think about what's the next thing, lots of things are coming up all the time. And I just put some examples here, like non-fungible tokens, which is being enabled by the blockchain revolution, sensory tech, AR, VR. All these new innovations, as they start to get more mature, they start to spawn a bunch of new channels and new experiences for customers that you need to think about when you're trying to engage. And so very much like I talked about before, it's always this experimentation phase. Be creative, be learning about those channels, and making sure you know when it's becoming relevant, and then you decide when you want to bring it into your mix. And the last thing is that it's kind of an exercise I do with some of my clients. And so if you're interested, reach out to your customer success exec, or reach out to me or Christina to talk about it. But I end up doing a little bit of an analysis on the digital marketing and community marketing strategies of the company in comparison to their market. And so what we do is we take a bunch of your competitors, a bunch of your market participants I talked about, and we do an assessment of their digital marketing strategy and the community marketing strategy. And we actually plot them on a grid. And we say, okay, where are you compared to your industry and your market? And it's really an insightful exercise, because it helps you understand where you want to zone in for your digital marketing strategy. In this case, is a real life example. I just redacted the names, but in this case, Company F, like 3 years ago, was a small little company that just got started and eventually became the leader in the market. And Company B is where I was employed. And a lot of it had to do with the attributes of what their digital marketing strategy was, what made them drive their growth like that. And so that's kind of a lot of the work I try to do here at Communitech, is try to help coach some of my clients to really adopt some of these attributes of scale into their go-to-market strategy moving forward. And that's all the content I have today. I don't know. I may have a few minutes if there's any questions. Otherwise.
Yeah, we do have, that's great. Thanks so much, Vinay. Very, very insightful information. And I like how you distilled it all down to, the basics and really easy to understand. There are 2 questions in the Q&A if you have a minute.
Yeah.
So the first one is, what are the tracking tools to measure performance of both your media channels and your website? Are there any free tracking tools, and how to use them?
Yeah, so when you say media channels, like, again, there's certain tools that are purpose-built for paid, owned, and earned. So like there's tools, there's a nice company out of Toronto actually called Trialfire that does a very good job of analyzing paid channels and looking at your performance across that and really connecting the ROI from the dollar you put in to the dollar you receive. And so that's an example of one paid channel one. And then the owned one, stuff like SEMrush and Moz and Ahrefs, these tools are very, very good to look at the performance of how your website is doing and your own properties, like who's backlinking to it, referring domains around it, and how you compare to your competitors when it comes to organic search traffic. And then on the earned one, there's a bunch of tools as well. I talked about Hootsuite, and I've used Sission before very, very successfully. And so there are ways to go and measure all of them. If you look at HubSpot and Salesforce, a lot of these MarTech stacks have the capability to go and track, across all channels, and you just have to set it up so that you have all the tags put in place so it's measuring that properly. So you can probably get away with doing that with your marketing automation stack. These tools supplement your marketing automation stack and go a bit more deeper. But yeah, it is a bit complicated answer to that question.
Okay, and the last question we have here is, when we turn a successful email campaign from A/B testing into a marketing email, our conversion drops. We've been told that this is because it's looking like a marketing email. Any suggestions? Oh,
so you tested it. Okay.
Sorry, they're A/B testing it manually. And then when they put it into HubSpot, their conversion drops.
Oh, interesting. Well, I would be interested just to see what your sample is on your A/B test that you're doing manually. If you're testing it with a friendly audience or an early adopter audience, you can see that will change significantly when you put it out to the mainstream audience. So I'd probably need to go and dig into the covers a little bit of how you're doing your tests. But that's usually when I see that happen, is when you test with friendlies and then you put it out to the main market and you see that drop. But happy to go deeper on that with whoever that is to see what could be behind that.
Great, thank you, Vinay. So just as a final reminder, a recording of today's session can be found on our website, communitech.ca. We have Ask Me Anything sessions happening every Tuesday. And we'll resume again in September. And if you'd like to chat with Vinay more, please reach out to your Communitech CSM or advisor, or myself, Christina.wood@communitech.ca, and I'm happy to get you connected. Thank you for joining today. I hope everyone has a great week. Thank you, Vinay, for sharing all of your insights and taking the time to join today. Always appreciate it. And we'll have a great week, everyone. Stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you again next time. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.